Joining us now via Skype, Jay DeLancy, the director of the Voter Integrity Project. Jay is Skyping in, I believe, from Raleigh, North Carolina. And yes, we do have Jay right there. We're going to start with you and then bring on someone else to discuss this. And for purposes of full disclosure, I should point out that Jay and I go way back. Gotta say this, pal, way back to our high school days. We both attended the Radio TV Institute in Chapel Hill, but then we got smart and went to school at NC State. That won't make Tar Heel fans happy, but we've got that all out there. So Jay, after that considerable preamble, this appeal, what is the deal going on? Why is this law being challenged?
Well, JD, thanks for having me. This is the first law, the first one that came out of the chute, really, after Holder was smacked down in a previous court ruling, where in the past the Department of Justice would actually write the terms of the law for each state to pass in their legislature or go to court. And the North Carolina one, it was called pre-clearance, and the Department of Justice, the Supreme Court took away that pre-clearance provision out of the Civil Rights Act of 1965, and in doing that, they were, North Carolina, the timing was perfect. So North Carolina wrote a law that really will take a dent out of vote fraud in this state. And so the other side doesn't like it, and that's why they went to court, to try and prevent that from happening.
Jay, you and your group at the Voter Integrity Project have documented some disturbing tendencies. In the recent past, give us a slice of the headlines of the findings you have found in terms of voter fraud in the Tar Heel state.
Well, in terms of legitimate, verifiable vote fraud, we've only gotten 5 of them over to prosecution. What we have is a lot of work in the pipeline. We're working with the state of North Carolina on an additional 150 people who were registered with the same name and the same date of birth, first name, last name, middle name, date of birth, and relatives that confirm through third-party media sources that these people were the same person, and they had voted in both Florida and North Carolina in 2012. And that's the tip of the iceberg, because we don't have the computing resources in terms of access to secret information like Social Security numbers, but the state does, and we've helped work with them to discover 35,000 people in 28 states who voted in North Carolina and in another state. But that's preliminary information. That number will come down, but the fact is there are a whole lot of people voting where it counts, which is a Democrat strategy that is very problematic, that people are actually going to a state that's a swing state and voting in that state, even though they're not citizens of that state. And that's what we're uncovering now with the help of the state. So 35,000 in the pipeline and 5 already at the DA's offices. So we're beginning to see an avalanche, and the 5 is the first few snowflakes of that avalanche.
Well, Jay, to move along on this, we want to get another perspective, and to bring in that perspective, we're calling on Josh Orton. Josh is the senior advisor at Progressives United. He's a former aide to Senate leader Harry Reid, and he joins us from Washington, D.C. today. So, Josh,
Hi, Josh.
Explain to us what's wrong, what's unconstitutional with having voters display an ID to prove who they are to go vote.
Well, I think there's a couple things. The first is this myth is that voting is like renting a video or renting a car or any of these other things. And while it originally sort of seems to make sense that if you require an ID for those things, why not for voting? Actually, in this country under our Constitution, the most important rights work the opposite way, just like freedom of speech. In those cases, our case law has dictated, and frankly, the foundation of our country has dictated, that for the most important fundamental rights in our country, it should actually be the easiest, and that the government should have the highest burden and face the most obstacles before putting any restrictions on the exercise of that right. So I think that's the first thing. The second thing is I'd like to actually point to what happened in Wisconsin. Scott Walker and the Republican legislature passed a fairly restrictive voter ID law here in Wisconsin, and it was challenged challenged in federal court. Now, the Republican Attorney General, J.B. Van Hollen, had an opportunity to go before that federal judge who conducted a full trial to explain and demonstrate all the examples, all the verified instances of voter fraud in Wisconsin as a way to justify that to get over that really high obstacle for the government to put in place restrictions on our most basic rights. He couldn't come up with a single verified instance, and so a federal judge struck down that law. Now, the Wisconsin Supreme Court did find one instance when the Republican Supreme Court of Wisconsin here upheld that law, and that one instance was a Scott Walker voter who, get this, his conduct would not have been prevented by the voter ID law. And so I really have to go back to this notion that this is a problem. This is a solution in search of a problem. There's really not a problem of voter fraud, and I'm interested that this project has done all this work and done all this research and come up with 5 examples that have not really been confirmed yet. So I understand that there's a lot of effort into this, but to me, this is not really an issue. It's a boogeyman. I've been to the smoke-filled rooms. There is no democratic strategy for voter fraud.
So it's an electoral boogeyman. Is that right, Jay DeLancy?
Oh yeah, I was saying, I don't want to interrupt Scott or Josh rather. First off, you talk about a constitutional right. Would you agree that checking the ID of someone going in to visit your old boss, Harry Reid, is that an infringement on someone's right to visit your boss?
Well, I don't think that's a fundamental, basic right of. I don't think visiting the Capitol building or restrictions on visiting the Capitol. That's not a.
Actually, addressing your politician and having a redress of grievances is a constitutional right.
But not.
So
entering the building is a specific thing.
Okay, well, how about the Second Amendment then? Would you oppose voter or any kind of ID for someone buying a gun? After all, it's a constitutional right, just as much as voting is.
Well, as far as I can tell, there are actually more restrictions in a lot of these states for voting than there are for buying a gun.
That's not true. Anyway, yeah, they don't do criminal background checks when you go to vote, so that's a nonsensical argument there. And the fact is, JD, when you have a crime that is committed and you have laws that protect the detection of that crime, that prevent detection. Example, no photography allowed in the polling enclosure, so you can't photograph someone who walks in 2 or 3 times. All you've got is eyewitnesses, and even then, they're busy. They're election employees. So the last thing you have is an observer who goes in there, and that's it. That's the only chance you have to stop people from voting multiple times. We have eyewitness accounts, testimonies in front of our legislature of one woman in particular who came in 3 times during a 4-hour period and voted twice till finally the observer got the judge involved. And the judge went over and stopped her from voting a 3rd time, but let her go. She said, "Ma'am, who are you voting for?" She looks down, the woman's voting for a man, and she said, "Look, you can't do that. Who is this person?" She goes, "It's my neighbor." And the lady said, "Well, you have to go." The judge said, "Go get your neighbor," and she let her go. So just because these crimes are not prosecuted doesn't mean they're not happening, Josh.
Well, and
they're
they're also, Josh, just one point. You didn't mention what left out of this conversation, not North Carolina nor Wisconsin, but Ohio. Infamously, Hamilton County, Cincinnati. A woman voting in the last presidential election 6 times, and she's back out on the streets because the feds haven't prosecuted.
Well, I appreciate these anecdotal answers, but none of what's been presented really seems to be much of a risk to the Republic. Now, when we talk about gun restrictions and we talk about background checks, this is looking at a problem from a large scale. I understand the conservatives are most upset when we look at individual instances of people who use guns for a nefarious purpose. Those, I think, when there's calls for regulation based on those individual circumstances, I believe that's when conservatives get the most upset. So to say, well, that's not okay, but one woman in one state voting a handful of times that did not affect a single election and is basically a minuscule, microscopic problem, to me is sort of the height of hypocrisy. This voter fraud is not a matter of opinion. It's a matter of math. And the math just does not support the types of infringements of rights that Jay and others are supporting. It just doesn't make sense.
Okay, well, Josh, how much you progressives like to argue on that it's a minor amount. It's just a minor. How much vote fraud is tolerable in the progressive world? How much do y'all think is an allowable percentage of an election that can be fraudulent
Well,
without any concern.
once we get to any measurable amount, then we can have that conversation.
Any
Nearly zero.
How about 5?
I don't think that's a question. 5.
Well, about 5.
It's an assertion that makes a point.
How many votes were cast in that election?
You know what's fascinating?
Okay.
So often we hear if there's only one, it's too far. That's what I hear from so many of my friends on the left. Maybe it ought to apply here. Listen, time prevents us from taking this further today, but I hope you both will come back to talk about this question. Jay DeLancy, Skyping in from Raleigh, North Carolina, and Josh Orton. It says Washington, D.C. I think he may be back in Madison, Wisconsin today. Wherever you are, Josh, we thank you for coming in and look forward to talking to you both again in the not-too-distant future. So, an interesting debate between Jay and Josh. What's your take on voter ID? You got to have one to cash a check. Why don't you tweet me your comments at Newsmax TV, #America's Forum, and we're coming back.